We all have the fear of ending up in a hospital. We know that it is a place where many deaths have been witnessed. We also know that it is a place where many souls grieve, hoping to find eternal peace. That's why today I bring you 5 horror stories that happened in hospitals. Our first story is titled, The Hospital Entity. It was a dark and stormy night when a group of young people decided to explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. The building structure seemed on the verge of collapse, but the young men's curiosity overcame their fear of the unknown. With flashlights and cameras in hand, they entered the hospital and began to walk the dark, dusty corridors. As they advanced, they could sense the presence of something sinister. Shadows seemed to move and strange sounds made them stop at various times. But, despite this, they continued their exploration. After walking for a while, they found a room that appeared to have been the hospital laboratory. Inside the room, there were broken glass vials and abandoned medical machinery everywhere. It was then that one of the young men noticed a dark figure standing in the corner of the room. At first they thought it was just their imagination, but the figure seemed to be moving slowly towards them. The young men began to scream and run for the exit, but found that all the doors were blocked. The figure was following them closely, and they could feel its evil presence behind them. Finally, they found a door that appeared to be open and headed for it. When they opened the door, they found themselves in a dark room with no exit. The dark figure was behind them, and they began to feel its presence closer and closer. The dark figure finally reached them in the dark room and began to choke them with his cold, skeletal hands. The young men tried to struggle, but their strength quickly diminished. As they faded away, they could see the dark figure transform into the body of one of the hospital's patients who had been subjected to atrocious experiments before dying. The dark figure had been released from its confinement in the abandoned hospital and now roamed the city in search of new victims. Young people became part of urban legends about the hospital, and many others who tried to explore the place also disappeared without a trace. Over time, it was rumored that the dark figure had claimed so many lives that it had become a malevolent and powerful entity, capable of controlling the minds and souls of its victims. And although the abandoned hospital had been demolished, the dark figure continued to roam the streets, searching for its next prey. The city was never the same after the night the young people disappeared in the abandoned hospital. Our second story is entitled, The Terminal Patient. A few months ago, I was diagnosed with a terminal illness. The doctors told me that there was nothing more they could do for me, that I could only wait and try to make my last days as comfortable as possible. So I was admitted to a hospital where I would spend the rest of my days. From the first day, I knew something was not right in that place. The nurses and doctors always seemed to be too busy, never having time for me. The hospital was always silent, except for the sound of the monitoring machines. And there was something strange about the way the other patients looked at me, as if they knew something I did not. One night, I woke up and saw a dark figure at the foot of my bed. I panicked and shouted for the nurses to come, but no one came. The figure approached me and I could feel its cold breath on my face. I closed my eyes, expecting the worst, but then everything faded away and I fell asleep. The next day, I told one of the nurses what had happened, but he simply told me it must have been a dream. However, the visits from the dark figure became more and more frequent. Sometimes, I could hear his haunting whispers in the darkness of the night, and other times, I could feel his cold breath on my neck. I began to feel weaker and weaker, and although the doctors administered pain medication, the pain would not go away. The dark figure became more aggressive, until finally I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed for help, but no one came. I woke up in a hospital room next to the doctors and nurses. They told me that I had suffered a cardiac arrest, but that they had managed to revive me. While I was recovering from the cardiac arrest in the hospital room, I started having terrible dreams. I dreamed of the dark figure, who had now become more violent and aggressive than ever. In my dreams, it chased me relentlessly and I could not escape from it. Every time I woke up, I felt a dark presence in the room, although I could not see anything. I knew something evil was there with me, watching me in the dark. It frightened me so much that I often refused to sleep, but exhaustion would eventually overcome me and I would sink into terrifying dreams. One day, while I was alone in the room, the dark figure materialized before me. It was so real that I could feel its cold breath on my face. It grabbed me with its skeletal hands and whispered in my ear in a language I could not understand. I felt a sharp pain in my chest and knew I was dying. But before my soul left my body, the dark figure transformed into a man who seemed to be long dead. He was one of the patients at the hospital who had been subjected to atrocious experiments and left to his fate. He told me that he had died in the hospital many years ago, but that his soul had not been able to rest in peace. He told me that he had now possessed me, and that my soul would be trapped in the abandoned hospital forever. He left me alone, trapped in the dark room, with no hope of escape. The dark presence returned to the room, and I knew I would be there forever, trapped in an endless cycle of suffering and pain. No one ever found out what had happened to me in the hospital again, and my name disappeared from the medical records. Rumors about the abandoned hospital continued to circulate for years, but no one ever knew the truth behind the disappearances and the dark presence that inhabited the place. My body was never found, and my soul could never find peace. Our third story is entitled, The Children in Sorrow. Once upon a time there was an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of the city. For years, rumors about the strange events that took place there spread among the inhabitants, but no one dared to go inside to discover the truth. A group of teenagers decided to face their fears and investigate what was behind the legend. So, one summer night, they gathered outside the hospital, armed with flashlights and courage. The entrance was blocked, but after a few attempts they managed to gain access through a broken window. The interior was dark and dusty, littered with debris and abandoned objects. As they made their way through the corridors, the feeling that something was wrong became more and more intense. Finally, they arrived at the hospital morgue. A cold and gloomy room, full of metal crates where the bodies of the deceased were once kept. At first, it seemed that everything was quiet, but little by little they began to hear strange noises. They were thuds coming from the metal crates. As they approached to investigate, they could hear small whispers that seemed to emanate from the crates. As they opened one of them, they were met with a sight that chilled their blood. Inside was a group of children, all of them with terrified expressions disfigured by fear. The young people then realized that the hospital had actually been an orphanage in the past. The children who had lived there, many of them sick and abandoned, had died alone and forgotten in the morgue, with no one caring for them. The youngsters tried to run out of the morgue, but the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside. The metal crates began to shake violently and the children began to climb out of them, surrounding them and dragging them into the depths of the morgue. The youngsters tried to struggle, but it was useless. The little ghostly bodies were stronger than they seemed, and little by little they began to possess them, taking over their minds and making them feel the pain and loneliness that they themselves had suffered in life. The young people were now trapped forever in the hospital morgue, turned into macabre toys for the ghostly children, who enjoyed torturing them day after day. Their cries were useless, no one could hear them, and their suffering would never end. The inhabitants of the city never knew what had really happened in that abandoned hospital, but those who dared to approach its walls claimed to have heard the wailing and desperate cries of the young people who were still trapped there. And although some tried to defy fate and enter to save them, they never came out alive again, becoming themselves victims of the horror that inhabited the morgue of that cursed place. Our fourth story is entitled, Revenge. I am a nurse in a city hospital. Since I started working here, I have seen all kinds of strange things, but what happened to me a few months ago was without a doubt the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. That night, there were few people in the hospital. I was on my night shift, checking medications and supervising patients. All was quiet, until I heard strange noises coming from the hallway. I went out to investigate, but no one was there. The door to a patient's room was open, but I saw no one inside. I thought it might be my imagination playing tricks on me, so I went back to work, trying to forget what had happened. However, the noises continued, and they were getting louder and louder. It was as if someone was walking the halls, but when I went out to investigate, I saw no one. I began to feel a shiver run through my body, as if something wasn't right. That's when I heard moaning coming from one of the rooms. It was a room where there was no patient assigned, but something told me I had to go in. When I opened the door, what I saw left me speechless. There was a figure lying on the bed, with pale skin and blank eyes. He didn't look human, it was as if he was dead. But the creepiest thing was that there was a guttural noise coming out of its mouth, as if it was trying to communicate with me. I approached the bed, trying not to show my fear. But when I tried to touch the patient, something strange happened. The figure suddenly disappeared, as if it had never been there. I froze, not knowing what to do. It was then that I saw a shadow move down the hallway. It was as if someone or something was watching me, following me. I started to run, but the hallway seemed endless, and the shadow kept chasing me. Finally, I reached the hospital exit door, breathing heavily. I looked back and saw a dark figure moving in the distance. I knew I had to get away from there as soon as possible. After that incident, I became obsessed with researching the history of the hospital. I discovered that many atrocities had been committed there, which had never been reported. I learned that a former doctor at the hospital, who had been accused of medical malpractice, had experimented on patients and committed several murders. There were also cases of nurses mistreating and abusing helpless patients. But what disturbed me most was the story of a girl who had been admitted to the hospital in the 1970s and had died there due to a strange illness. According to legends, her spirit was still roaming the hospital, seeking revenge against those who had harmed her. After discovering all this, I began to have recurring nightmares in which I would see the girl walking through the corridors of the hospital, her eyes rolling and her mouth open as if she were trying to tell me something. One night, while doing research in the records room, I heard the door close behind me. As I turned around, I saw the girl in front of me with a macabre smile on her face. I tried to escape, but the door was locked. The girl slowly approached me, as if she was enjoying my fear. She stared at me and said in a whisper, "I am here for you. You will not be able to escape my vengeance." At that moment, the light went out, leaving me in complete darkness. I felt cold hands grab me, and a chilling laugh echoed in my ears. When they turned on the light, I was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. Since then, I have never been the same. Sometimes, in my dreams, I still see the girl laughing as she approaches me with a knife in her hand, ready to carry out her eternal revenge. Our fifth story is entitled Urban Exploration. I love the idea of exploring abandoned and old places, so when I heard that Lima's hospital was abandoned, I couldn't resist. I gathered a group of friends and we planned our urban exploration. When we arrived at the hospital, the atmosphere was ominous. The broken windows and peeling walls reminded us of the darkness of the place's history. Nevertheless, we eagerly entered the building, hoping to find some interesting objects. But as we made our way through the dusty corridors, I noticed something strange. The energy of the place seemed different, as if there was something other than us in the building. We continued exploring, and that's when we found the morgue. There was a staircase leading down to a dark basement, so we decided to go down to investigate. As we descended, the air became cold and damp. The only source of light was the flashlight on my phone, which barely illuminated the darkness. Suddenly, we heard a sound coming from behind an old door. Cautiously, we approached the door and pushed it gently. But before we could see what was behind the door, something pushed us back with unearthly force. One of my friends hit his head and started bleeding. As we tried to help him, I noticed something moving behind us. I turned around and saw a shadow moving across the ground. I began to feel a shiver run through my body. The shadow began to take shape, revealing a female figure. She was wearing a white dress and was covered in blood. Her face was disfigured and her empty eyes stared at me. "Run away!" I shouted to my friends as I tried to drag the injured one away. But the figure was getting closer and closer, and I could feel his icy breath on the back of my neck. Suddenly, it lunged at me and threw me to the ground. I felt a pressure on my chest and began to lose consciousness. When I woke up, I was alone in the basement with the body of my dead friend next to me. All around me, the atmosphere was darker and heavier than before. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't move. That's why I saw the figure again. This time it was standing over my dead friend, and it was looking me straight in the eyes. "Your friend died because of you," he said in a cold, chilling voice. "And now it's your turn." I stood there, trapped and terrified, as the figure moved closer and closer to me. I knew I wasn't going to survive, but in my last breath, I screamed for help. When I opened my eyes again, I was in the hospital, surrounded by nurses and doctors. They told me I had been found in the basement of the hospital, unconscious and with signs of having suffered a severe concussion. But what terrified me even more was that I was told I was alone when they found me. No one knew how I had gotten to the basement, or how I had survived there alone for so long. The only thing I knew for sure was that I would never explore abandoned places again. After my experience in the abandoned hospital in Lima, I began to have recurring nightmares about the female figure. Sometimes she appeared in my dreams as a vengeful spirit, other times as a demon seeking my soul. I would always wake up in a cold sweat, trembling with fear. Years passed, and although I tried to forget what had happened in that basement, I never could. Every time I passed by the abandoned hospital in Lima, I felt a sense of fear and unease. One night, on my way home from work, I decided to drive by the hospital again. Although I knew it was a silly idea, I couldn't resist. But this time, as I drove through the basement of the hospital, I saw something that chilled my blood. The female figure was standing there, in the same place where she had attacked me years before. This time, her appearance was even more terrifying. Her skin was grayish and rotting, and her eyes glowed with a strange red glow. It was as if it had come back from hell to look for me. Suddenly, my car stopped dead in its tracks. I tried to start it again, but something seemed to be preventing the engine from running. That's when the figure began to approach my car. "Are you still here?" he asked in a voice that made my hair stand on end. "I thought you ran away." I tried to open the car door, but it was locked. The figure came closer and closer until he was right in front of my window. "You belong to me now," he said with an evil grin on his disfigured face. "And together, we will explore the darkest places of the night forever." And so, I became the eternal companion of the female figure, trapped forever in the dark and sinister abandoned hospital in Lima. I hope these stories have been to your liking. If so, do not forget to leave a like, that would help us many. If you want to receive more content of this type, do not forget to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Until next time, member of the creepy world.